Good morning. This lecture video is going to go over the physiology involved in the female reproductive system, specifically looking at the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle and the different structures and hormones that are involved in those processes. We're going to start with the ovarian cycle. So think back to your ovaries and the anatomy of the ovaries, and I'll show you a diagram of that in a second. But ultimately what the ovarian cycle is its goal is to make a secondary oocyte that can be fertilized by a sperm. So a mature egg cell. That's what our ultimate goal is of the ovarian cycle. In childhood, your ovaries grow and they secrete a small amount of estrogen, and that small amount of estrogen actually inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing GnRH. But when puberty happens, GnRH becomes activated, it's released from the hypothalamus, and it triggers the anterior pituitary gland to produce FSH and LH, which then act on the ovaries. And this is going to stimulate this ovarian cycle. This will continue throughout adulthood until menarche occurs, which would be menopause. There are three general stages of the ovarian cycle: the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. Here's a picture showing you the ovary. That you can see here that, again, we're going to start with primordial follicles, and they're going to go through a maturation period until we actually have a secondary oocyte or a mature egg that will eventually get released into the fallopian tubes, where it will travel down to the uterus, where hopefully fertilization will occur. So let's talk about how this process actually works. We're going to start, here's my ovary, okay? I know I'm a fantastic drawer, right? And we're going to start right here, right? This would actually be day 0, okay? If we're moving along counterclockwise here, this would be day 13. This would be day 14. Okay, just to give us an idea of this first half. Remember, this is a 28-day cycle. We're going to start at day 0 with the primordial follicle here. Okay, and remember that a primordial follicle is going to have a primary oocyte in it. Okay, so this would be the primary oocyte. And then it's surrounded by granulosa cells. So let's make those just kind of yellowish, right? So these are going to be, see that? Granulosa cells. Now, granulosa cells are going to secrete hormones, specifically estrogen, a little bit of progesterone, and a little bit of inhibin. So if you look here, what's going to happen, as you can see, is that as we go through this process, as this follicle matures, we're going to end up with more granulosa cells. Okay, they're going to multiply and they're going to fill in. So I want you to kind of keep in mind that as we mature, we're going to have more granulosa cells. And that means that because we have more cells, we're going to have more hormones, because we have more of these cells secreting it. So that's our starting point, is a primordial follicle. So the next stage of development then is going to be up here, which are called the primary follicles. Now, the primary follicle is going to be a stage, and we'll kind of draw it here, where the oocyte and the granulosum cells, so we'll kind of put that on the outside again, there's going to be a new layer that forms in between them. And this is called the zona pellucida, right? So we're going to put, so the zona pellucida. Now the zona pellucida is going to have little gaps in there that still allows those granulosa cells to kind of nourish that oocyte. But we do have this layer. This layer will stay around the oocyte all the way through the rest of this process. So it will never disappear. And again, it will be, or it will lie in between the granulosa cells and the oocyte. Now remember that this oocyte is still kind of stuck in meiosis 1. So it still has the full number of chromosomes in it. It hasn't had that reduction quite yet. So during this next stage then, we're going to have a preantral follicle. And a preantral follicle is going to get a layer that surrounds it here in green. That's called the theca layer. And the theca layer has LH, or receptors for luteinizing hormone, all over it. And what happens is that when luteinizing hormone then is released and it binds with the receptors on the theca, then it's going to produce a chemical called androstenedione. This is then going to be converted into estrogen. So we are going to, at this phase, start to see a rise in estrogen levels within our bloodstream. So let's just we'll add some arteries and veins in here just so that you can kind of see that there is a blood supply. So I mean, that estrogen essentially is going to go into these arteries and veins and start circulating around the body, and we're going to see an increase in estrogen levels in our bloodstream because of the interaction between the theca and the luteinizing hormone that's being released. So antral, what does an antral mean? So you'll see this on this next stage, which is called the early antral follicle, and you'll see it get even larger here on this stage over here. And an antrum is just basically refers to the fluid that's being produced by the granulosum cells. So during these 3 stages, we're going to start to see an increase in this production of antrum, or this production of fluid. It's this fluid, this antrum, that's actually going to end up putting pressure on the follicle walls. That's going to actually cause it to explode and release the oocyte when we get to that point. It is important to kind of make note that I'm showing like one follicle that's developing and forming, but you should keep it in mind that this is happening all over the place inside the ovary. So there's not just one preantral follicle and one early antral follicle. There's actually a whole bunch of these that are developing into mature follicles. Only one of those follicles will release an oocyte, and that one is called the dominant follicle, probably the largest one, but there are many that are actually occurring at once. And we're kind of going to call this one the dominant follicle. That's the one we're kind of focused on. And so you can imagine that all of these other follicles that would be developing over time are basically going to die in a process called atresia, and we're going to lose several possible oocytes during any one of these cycles, because only one will actually become the dominant one and mature, whereas the other ones will die. Now, eventually, this dominant, or what we would call scientifically the mature follicle, is going to build up with fluid. It's going to build up with pressure. It's going to actually push against this ovarian wall here, and at some point, the wall is going to break, and the follicle is going to spit out here the oocyte, the mature oocyte. Okay, so this is going to happen at about day 14 in the ovarian cycle. And some women actually can feel some of the pressure from that occurring. Some don't, but this is going to be the point now where this follicle actually is going to explode, more or less, as it releases that oocyte into the fimbriae of the uterine tubes, and it will then travel down through the uterine tubes. Now, in the vast majority of cases, only one oocyte will get released, but occasionally what will happen is more than one oocyte will end up being released, and this is what actually leads to the formation of twins or triplets, where there's more than one fertilized egg, more than one oocyte that was released and then fertilized. So we have the egg that's out here now, but what happens to this follicle? Well, this follicle is actually going to kind of change into a structure called the corpus luteum. During this transformation, the granulosum cells that are in there are going to start producing lots of hormones. So we're going to get a lot of estrogen, progesterone, and that inhibin that we talked about. That inhibin actually causes follicle stimulating hormone to be reduced or to stop being produced. So this whole process is triggered by follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and so inhibin is going to slow the production of that, and thus the activity that's occurring within this ovary. If the egg does not get fertilized, eventually the corpus luteum will reach a maximum size in about 10 days, and then it will just disintegrate itself through the process of apoptosis. Now, if the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum will not self-destruct through apoptosis. It will keep living, and it's important that it keeps living because we want it to keep producing estrogen and progesterone, which will help the endometrium layer of the uterus prepare itself for implantation, which is really handy because we want that fertilized cell then to be able to implant into the uterine wall. Now, this process doesn't continue for the entire lifespan of a woman. Once they hit menopause, this process will actually cease to occur. So women cannot produce mature oocytes their entire lifespan, unlike a man. So let's just kind of recap this whole process with some actual slides and words and something different than just this amazing artwork that I did. So during the follicular stage, during the early and middle follicular phases, follicle-stimulating hormones are going to stimulate the granulosa cells to actually reproduce, to proliferate, and then to secrete estrogen. And luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate those theca cells to proliferate and produce the androgens or estrogens that the granulosa cells use to make estrogen. So during this particular period, estrogen exerts a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary gland to inhibit the secretion of GnRH by the hypothalamus. During the late follicular phases, blood estrogen becomes high enough to elicit a surge of LH, okay? And then this is going to cause, via the granulosa cells, completion of the egg's first mitotic division and maturation, ovulation, and formation of the corpus luteum. So that's during this first kind of stage. Once ovulation occurs, the ovary wall will rupture and expel that secondary oocyte. If fertilized, it will release one, hopefully. If fertilization occurs, then what will happen is the egg will eventually embed itself into the uterine wall. And if it doesn't occur, we would then go into the luteal phase, which the ruptured follicle is going to collapse. The granulosum cells and the thecal cells will form the corpus luteum, which are going to secrete progesterone and estrogen. If there's no pregnancy, that corpus luteum will degenerate into the corpus albicans in 10 days through apoptosis. And if pregnancy does occur, then it's going to produce hormones until the placenta takes over at about 3 months. So that kind of sums up the ovarian cycle. Here is a picture. So again, you got the primordial follicle, the primary follicle. Then you go in, the follicular stage takes about 1 to 14 days. So this is going to be when the follicle actually grows. Ovulation is going to occur mid-cycle. And then the luteal phase is going to be the period of corpus luteum activity, which is day 14 through 28. And then again, it will degenerate if there's no pregnancy. So follicular stage, we're making this follicle. Ovulation, the follicle releases the oocyte. The luteal phase is going to be the development of the corpus luteum. So that summarizes what's going on during the ovarian cycle. So if we're looking here kind of at what happens in terms of hormone activity, well, you've got your hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. This will happen roughly around puberty. That's going to cause FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, to be released by the anterior pituitary glands. They are going to bind and work together or activate the granulosum cells, which will actually produce inhibin, and also the thecal cells, which will produce androgens that will get converted into estrogen. So at this particular time, you'll get a slightly elevated estrogen and some rising inhibin levels in the blood. Then positive feedback is going to be exerted by large changes or increases in estrogen output. So as more estrogen is produced, it's going to circulate through the blood. The hypothalamus is then going to release or cause the release of LH in large amounts. That LH is going to play a role in rupturing that follicle to release the secondary oocyte. And then once we get to the corpus luteum stage, progesterone and estrogen are going to increase, as well as the production of inhibin. The effects of estrogen and progesterone in general. So estrogen induces secondary sex characteristics. It promotes oogenesis and follicular growth in the ovary. It supports the rapid but short-lived growth spurts at puberty. It maintains low-level blood cholesterol and high HDL levels, and it helps facilitate calcium uptake. So there's a lot of jobs that estrogen does that are not just specific to what we talked about in the ovary. Progesterone is the other main hormone. It works with estrogen to establish and regulate the uterine cycle. And the effects of placental progesterone during pregnancies will inhibit uterine motility and help prepare the breast for lactation. So the follicular stage of the ovarian cycle that we just talked about, that's going to be essentially equivalent to the menstrual and the proliferatory phases of the uterine cycle. And the luteal phase, so where that corpus luteum starts to develop in the ovarian cycle, is going to be equivalent to the uterine secretory phase. So basically, these two are going to line up with the follicular phase, so that follicle development in the ovary, and this one is going to correspond to the luteal phase. So during menstruation, the plasma estrogen and progesterone levels fall as a result of the breakdown of the corpus luteum. In the proliferatory phase, the estrogen will stimulate the growth of the endometrium and the myometrium, and cervical mucus will become more readily available, penetrable by sperm. And in the secretory phase, progesterone is going to convert the estrogen-primed endometrium to a secretory tissue. And the cervical mucus will become impermeable to sperm, and this will actually inhibit uterine contraction. So here is, again, the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle. So day 1 through 5 is typically the menstrual phase, 5 through 15 is the proliferatory phase, and then secretory phase will make up the remaining days. If we were to combine the two cycles, so here's the uterine cycle, here's the ovarian cycle. This is a great visual to kind of compare them, all right? So during primary follicular development, until we kind of get to that antrum, this is going to be during menses, and at this point in time, we have estrogen levels that are rising, inhibin levels rising a little bit until towards the end, day 14 there, and progesterone is also slightly rising. Then, when we get into this stage after ovulation, so here's ovulation stage, the secretory phase and the corpus luteum formation phases, you're going to see a huge spike in the amount of hormones that are present. Okay, except for estrogen. Estrogen levels will start to decrease, but inhibin and progesterone are going to skyrocket. Okay, so really, if you think about these first couple phases, inhibin and progesterone they're increasing, but they're really not increasing very much. It's a very, very slow rate. It's a pretty steady rate of hormone production. But estrogen is rising, then estrogen is going to take a dive in the second half, and the inhibin and progesterone levels will increase. If fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum, which is maintained by a hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, will be maintained. It'll keep that corpus luteum from disintegrating, like I said, until the placenta takes over. This is the chemical that is tested for using a pregnancy test. They're testing for the presence of this HCG hormone in order to see if pregnancy has occurred. That pretty much summarizes the physiology and the hormone activity involved in the female reproductive cycle.